Hi, my name's Rob Gentile, and thank you for the opportunity for me to share my extraordinary story. I've had two near-death experiences, both precipitated by a massive heart attack. What happened to me is that I live in North Carolina now, but I had gone to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in January of 2016 to have some bone spurs removed from my neck that I had gotten when I was involved in the martial arts in high school. And I had this pain in my neck that I couldn't get rid of. So I went to Pittsburgh, and it's a relatively simple surgery. There's a very famous Korean doctor there. And instead of cutting the back of your neck open to take these bone spurs out, and then, of course, your discs have to be fused and you're in pain the rest of your life, his surgery is very unique, and people come from all over the world to get it. So he goes in through the front and cuts a small slit in the neck, moves the esophagus, and drills out these bone spurs. Of course, you're unconscious and you're in the hospital for one night, relatively simple surgery. So I had the surgery, and 3 days later, I'm back in my home in North Carolina. It was about 11:30 at night, and all of a sudden, my wife is awoken by these screams in the house that she had never heard before. Now, we have one child, my daughter Maria, who's special needs. She can't walk, talk, feed herself. She has Rett syndrome, and she has a seizure disorder. So the first thing my wife thought is that my daughter was having a seizure. So she wakes up and runs down the hall, and Maria is sleeping just fine. And she comes back into the bedroom, and it's me flopping around in the bed and screaming in pain. She turns on the light, and I say to my wife, Melanie, I have never felt a pain like this before in my life, and it's the last thing I remember. I passed out from the pain. My wife dials 911. A neighbor runs over to watch Maria. The ambulance gets there very quickly, and thank God we're only about 3 miles away from the hospital. So the EMT comes in. They know I'm having a heart attack. They just don't know how bad it is. So I'm rushed to the hospital, and when we get in, it's late, and the cardiologist is not in the hospital. So they give me some kind of medicine, probably nitroglycerin, something to thin my blood. They put my wife and myself on the gurney in the room with a nurse, and the nurse tells my wife, looks like he's stable. He should be fine until the cardiologist gets here. And the moment she said that, in what my wife says was like a moment out of the movie The Exorcist, it was almost as if somebody had grabbed me and pulled me forward on the gurney with great force. I sprung forward on the gurney from my waist up, and my eyes popped wide open, and I screamed out the name Frosty. When I screamed out the name Frosty, I had collapsed backward on the gurney and flatlined. Code blue rang out on the hospital floor, and in rushed a doctor with her team. And my wife turns to this doctor, who's now a friend of mine, Dr. Patel, and says, you have to save his life. We have a special needs child. She's not going to make it without him, and I cannot do this alone. Talk about pressure on a doctor. So they take my wife out of the room, and they begin working on me. And they tried everything. And all of this is in my medical records. They tried, obviously, defib shocks. They tried vigorous sternal rubs. 5 minutes went by. I was not responding. 10 minutes went by. I still wasn't responding. So then they tried epinephrine, which is to try to jumpstart the heart, which they have to stick this long needle down into your heart. They gave me 4 injections of epinephrine. 20 minutes had gone by. I was still not responding. Then the cardiologist finally arrived in the hospital. They cut open my thigh, did an emergency catheterization, and he found the blockage in my widowmaker, my LAD artery, put in 2 stents, and blood finally started to flow, but it was too late. I was in cardiogenic shock and respiratory failure. Another doctor rushed into the room and intubated me, shoved the tubes down my throat. I was on the vent, where I would lay in a 4-day coma. And that's how it all started with me. But what was so incredible about this is that I was raised Catholic. I'm originally from Pennsylvania. I was raised Catholic, and my oldest brother drove down from Pennsylvania, and he called the local parish priest. The parish priest comes in, anoints me with oil, gives me my last rites. And during that 4-day period, I don't know how they do this, but several neurologists came in to test me to see if I were brain dead. And finally, on the 4th day, the doctor told my wife, we've got to take out the tubes. He's probably a vegetable, but if he breathes on his own, we'll see what we have. They took out the tubes, and obviously I started choking, and they take me into recovery, and my arms were paralyzed for the first several days. And it was my wife that came into the room first. And she said I was talking like a little child. And I kept on saying, Melanie, you have to believe me. You have to believe me. It was Frosty. Frosty came to me. And she said, oh my God, Rob, that makes so much sense. And I said, what are you talking about? And she said, right before you flatlined, you sprang forward on the gurney, your eyes popped open, and you screamed out Frosty's name and then collapsed. And to give you some background, Frosty was my brother-in-law, and he was the same age as me, 56 years old, when I died that night. And unfortunately, 7 weeks prior to that night that I had passed away, almost, Frosty had taken his own life. And Frosty was going through a really bad divorce at the time, and he had struggled with drugs in the past, but he had been clean for several years. But it was around Christmas, and he was living in the upstairs bedroom of his parents' house, which is about 40 miles from here. And, he had his own business. He was a land surveyor. He had one child, his only daughter in college, paying college bills. All this pressure was building up on Frosty, and he decided to go out one night and try to blow off some steam, and got a hold of a street drug that drove him mad for like 40 minutes. So about 5:30 in the morning, his mother had called me and said, could you please come down to the house and go up into the bedroom to see if you can find some kind of a journal or a note or something to tell us why Frosty had done this. So I went up into that room 7 times and picked through a rather gruesome scene, finally found a journal, and I had given it to the family. So that was the first thing that happened to me. And, the reason why that's so important is that being raised Catholic at the time, and I know the rules have changed now, but at the time, if you took your own life, it was considered a mortal sin, which means you went straight down. There was no coming back from that. But when my wife came to me, she said, tell me exactly what Frosty said to you. And Frosty said to me, I've made a big mess of things, and you have to go back and help clean things up. But tell my parents I'm in a good place. So this was the first huge paradigm shift in my belief system. I mean, here was Frosty, who had taken his own life, but he was in a good place. And it really gave me pause in that moment, lying there in the bed paralyzed, because then I realized that these were just man-made rules, and a loving God wouldn't condemn anybody for such a very complicated act, particularly when you're not in your right mind. So that gave me a tremendous amount of both freedom, and it changed my entire belief system in the sense that I knew then that a loving God would not condemn like that. And the second most extraordinary thing that happened to me was on the second day, this beautiful Indian woman with glistening brown eyes came to me, and she pulled a chair up beside my bed. I'm still in recovery, and she knew that my arms were paralyzed. And she reached down. I didn't know who she was. Obviously, I was unconscious, and she reached down and she put her hands on mine, and she began to tell me that I'm Dr. Patel. I was the doctor on call that night that kept working on you and kept working on you. And she began to cry. And she said, I can't tell you how many times I almost lost you. And then it got very personal, which I found peculiar. She began to talk about her father. And she began to tell me that, my father and I were so close. He helped me through medical school. We could almost read each other's thoughts. And she said, I'm Hindu. I'm a very spiritual person. And she said, all my father lived for was to see my firstborn child. And 6 months before my son was born, my father passed away suddenly from an aneurysm. And she said, since then, I've been very bitter. I've kind of lost my faith, my spirituality. But seeing you here alive gives me hope that maybe, just maybe, there's something else out there. And in that moment, it was almost like this puzzle unscrambled, and it hit me while she was working on me. Another male spirit had entered the room and kept on saying over and over again, keep working on him. You can save him. Don't give up. Keep working on him. And it hit me as Dr. Patel's father speaking through me, because something compelled her to work on me for more than 20 minutes. I mean, she should have called it in the first 5 minutes. And I didn't have the courage to tell her then. It was a year later that I came back to interview her. And all the doctors, the cardiologist, the respiratory doctor that intubated me, I came back to interview them for my book, that I finally had the courage to sit down, and it was in the hospital cafeteria. I brought her a dozen roses, and I sat down and told her that story. And now, every year on her father's birthday, we talk about her father and how he never really left her, and he's always by her side in the operating room. So it was extraordinary. But you can imagine, after that, it was Dr. Patel that told me my heart was destroyed. And the only way that I could survive was to get a heart transplant. So as you can imagine, hearts are in very short supply, even to this day. My heart was so weak when I left the hospital, they put me in a defibrillator vest, which looks kind of like a policeman's vest. And every time my heart would go out, which was often, it would shock me back to life. Talk about PTSD. And as my heart continued to weaken after that, they actually cut me here and they put a port in my chest that was dripping this medicine on my heart called milrinone. Milrinone, my doctor said, think of it of like STP for a car. It makes it run better. So it pumps the heart unnaturally, but it starts the clock ticking because it wears the heart out very quickly. So that was January 26th that I died, and I could not find a heart anywhere. No one would give me a heart. We have two very good transplant centers here in North Carolina. I couldn't get a heart. I sent my records everywhere. No one would give me a heart. Finally, I was about to resign from my company, and I called my boss. The company I work for is based in Chicago, and I told him that I was going to resign. And he talked to the owner of the company, who sits on the medical board at the University of Chicago Medicine, which I never knew. So he helped me get admitted to the University of Chicago Medicine. So on April 20th of 2016, I got admitted to the University of Chicago Medicine, where I would undergo months of pre-transplant testing to see if I even qualified for a heart. So I went through these months of pre-transplant testing because when you get a heart, there are several things that will disqualify you to get a heart, things like cancer, other things that disqualify you because you're on immune suppressants the rest of your life. So in theory, if there's another disease state living in you, they won't give you a heart. They won't sacrifice a heart because they're in short supply. So this whole process took months on, and I was getting sicker and weaker all the time. Finally, I got pneumonia in my right lung. They had to impale me with a drainage tube. They had put a pump in me to try to keep me alive, but nothing was working. Then the ultimate disappointment came, and it was late May when my team came to me and said, Rob, we found something in you that disqualifies you for transplant. And they took me off the transplant list. And at that time, I'm about 174 pounds. I had wizened down to about 132 pounds. I was unrecognizable by my own family. I was green. I looked like a wizened old man. I was barely alive. And that's what happened that night. And I was on the 8th floor of the University of Chicago Medicine. And when they took me off the transplant list, I called my wife back here in North Carolina. I told her that I couldn't get a heart. She almost had a nervous breakdown. And I told her I'm just going to come home and die naturally. And that night I was in my room on the 8th floor, and my room faced Lake Michigan. And when you're that high up, it's almost like you're in the middle of the lake. And Lake Michigan looks like it's the ocean. And this incredible storm had whipped up out of nowhere that I had never seen before. A storm like that. I mean, lightning and thunder, heavy sheets of rain slamming against my window. I was alone in my room. And it was then that it was almost as if I was a magnet drawing to me every negative thought, every mistake that I had ever made in my life, things that I had been ashamed of. All of these things were coming to me. And things like, you have no value, you never found your purpose, your life has been a waste, you prayed for your daughter to die, all these shameful things. It was like this dark entity had entered the room, and it was baiting me, trying to weaken my spirit, and it was working. And it was then that all of a sudden I had worked myself up into, I guess, an anxiety attack. I started breathing heavily, sweating. My heart was pounding. My heart went into tachycardia. I can hear the alarm going off on the heart monitor, and I just cried out, "Do with me what you will." And it was in that moment that I was taken up into a place that I call in the book the ethereal. It was kind of like this place where the veil was pulled back for who knows how long, a second, a millisecond, enough to give me kind of a glimpse of the spiritual realm. And I remember I found myself standing in the middle of nowhere. The best way to explain this is like you're flying in an airplane and you're looking outside the window. It's a crystal clear blue day and you can see everything. but really you're looking at nothing. And that's what it was like. I'm standing there in the middle of nowhere and I'm thinking to myself, this is inexplicable. What is happening? And I could see my broken, atrophied green body dying in my bed. I could hear the alarm going off, and yet I could see myself standing in the middle of the nowhere in that same green hospital gown, perfect and whole. And then I remember being disappointed because I did not see God. There were no angels that came to greet me, my parents who have died before me, friends. Nobody was there. There was no music. The five senses didn't seem to have any functionality there. In other words, I couldn't taste, smell, or touch anything. But then it was almost as if communication was telepathic and synchronistic at the same time. All of a sudden, I began to understand that if I wanted to know the answer to any question, all I had to do was think about it. And that's when it felt like I was connected to the vast wisdom of the universe, all of it without words. It was almost as if the grains of my being were made of sand and someone picked me up and scattered me across this infinite, timeless universe. And it was then that God expressed as an imprint of concepts that I wholly understood in that moment. Concepts like, I am the power behind all things. My power is omnipotent. This is the foundation for everything. This is the divine source. This is your real identity. And in that moment, I knew that I was not my body, my race, or my religion. I was connected to everything all at once. And I also knew in that moment that God both expresses and experiences life through us. You know, my father had died from a steel mill accident when I was 5 years old, and I had struggled trying to find my own identity all the way up into early adulthood. And I realized in that moment that I came through my parents, not from them, and that my real identity was this place of love and light, the love and light of the Creator. And it was then that one of the most extraordinary things happened. I saw and became part of this gigantic web made of twinkling lights. And the best way to describe this web is that in science class, we all remember what a neuron looks like. So a neuron has a nucleus and it has tentacles and dendrites, and they connect with one another, just like in your brain or a solar system or a plant. And inside each one of these little nucleuses was a spark or a quark of light. And it was this magnificent web made of trillions and trillions and trillions of these twinkling, sparkling quarks of light. And this beautiful tapestry was woven together, and it was stretched into infinity and just hanging on the ceiling of the universe. And it was shown to me that these quarks, or sparks of light, are made of a variety of different quarks that combine to create infinite possibilities in the universe. And they're made of light. These quarks combine to create a planet, a person, a tree, or a dog. It doesn't matter. All things are one. We're all made of the same stuff, animate and inanimate objects. We just manifest differently. And it was shown to me that God uses light to create, heal, and transform us. And while I was part of this web, I realized that I was connected to everything. And being connected to everything, I knew in that moment that loneliness is just an illusion. And I thought, while I was connected to everything, and I was just one spark of light in this beautiful divine web of consciousness, that if I hurt myself, I hurt everything connected to me. But if I love, the light would spread. And, you know, this gets very personal, but I'll share it. And it's in my book. And I've mentioned my daughter, Maria. She's 28 now. When I had died that night, she was 20. And I've never had a conversation with Maria. Very painful because she doesn't have language. And it was there, coming out of that web, that Maria came out of the web. And there she was, standing in the middle of nowhere. And she was perfect and whole. She had this light emanating through her eyes, not the kind of light that you and I see in the natural world, but that spiritual light that we're all made of, that spiritual light that animates all life. And I said to her, Maria, in this unspoken language of the ethereal, I've never heard your voice. I have never heard you say, I love you, Dad. Your mother and I We've taken you everywhere to find a cure, to ease your suffering. Please just tell me what it is that I could do for you. And she said 3 words that transformed my life. She said, just love me. And when she said, just love me, I cried out into that infinite expanse that I never want to leave this place. And when I said that, I found myself back in my hospital bed and the nurse rushing in the room to put some medicine in my IV bag to stabilize me. And that was the end of my near-death experience. And, it was shortly after that my doctor came in and told me that they had appealed to the government and they won an exception to transplant me. So on June 6th of 2016, I was transplanted. And I don't want to spoil anything for anyone who might want to read the book, because all of that is in the book and it's an extraordinary part of my experience. I'll say this about it. To have another human being living inside of you is one of the most fascinating things that you can ever imagine, because the heart is not just a muscle and it's not just another organ. The heart is the seat of the soul. The heart is one of the first things that develops in a mother's womb. So this connection between the heart and the brain starts very early on. It's one of the reasons why heart transplantation works, because when you take someone's heart out and put in a stranger's heart, the heart has to find new ways to communicate with the brain, to communicate neurologically, to develop hormones, new pathways, the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems. And the most fascinating way it communicates is through an electromagnetic field that emanates from the heart center out around us like an aura. It's where our intuition resides. And it's in the heart where memories and preferences, and a lot of my preferences changed after my heart transplant, my tastes in music and emotions and moods and all of these things that I still live with today because this person continues to express through me. So it was another incredible part of my whole near-death and then new life experience coming out of heart transplant. So something that I have learned throughout my journey, which I would like to share, is that I realized that, when all of this wardrobe comes off, including our skin color, we will find that at our very essence, we are made of light. We are all one, and we're all connected. You see, that's the beauty of it. And that's my central message of something that we have to realize, particularly now in this day and age, when it seems like the whole world is falling apart and everyone is so disconnected. We have to understand and we have to unify to save ourselves and to realize that we're all one. So this is what I'd like to leave you with. When we realize that we're all connected and that we're all one, that we all come from this same place, this place of divine love and light, only then will we realize that we'll find peace within ourselves and peace within our world. Thank you.